I think he's heading this way. He better be. You're up.
Great. Sweet. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
All right. Let's turn to the book of Deuteronomy this morning. We're continuing on in our Who I Am, God's self-revelation unto the children of Israel, and that pretty much follows the life of Moses. We're getting down to our last lesson here, and it includes the death of Moses. So we began with the birth, ending with the death, going through his life, his experiences with the children of Israel. Now, we're going to finish up last week first before we continue on with the last lesson. I'll get to it, y'all. All right, so in our last lesson we were looking at I am loving, Lord, and in section B of your books, if you have your books, it's the 11th lesson, and that is threats to Israel's love for God. Before we begin, I gave you some things that were kind of a reoccurring theme in the book of Deuteronomy last week. Can anybody name what a few of those were? We're going to look at chapter 6 beginning. Yeah, that's where we'll be at first.
Oh, in Deuteronomy. I'm talking about
11. Does anybody remember some of the reoccurring themes that Moses speaks about during the book of Deuteronomy? We went over last week. That was one of them. Yep, over and over throughout the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is imploring the children of Israel to fear the Lord. Verse number 10 of chapter 4, and I'll just flip through these. You're welcome to flip through some of them as well. But chapter 4, verse number 10, especially the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me. It was his desire, God's desire, that they would learn to fear him. Then also in verse number 29, oh, that there was such an heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Verse number 2 of chapter 6, that thou mightest fear the Lord thy God. Verse 24 of chapter 6, and the Lord commanded us to do all those statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always. Verse number 6 of chapter 8, therefore thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God and walk his ways, and to fear him. So over and over and over, and you could continue on. That is one of the reoccurring themes in the book of Deuteronomy. What is another? We went over, I believe, 3. In a sense. If you look at verse number 29, it actually encompasses of chapter 5, verse 29 of chapter 5, it actually encompasses all 3 of them in that one verse. Oh, that there were such an heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them. That was another one. Over and over and over, he's talking about obedience throughout, but there's a reason for obedience. There was a reason that he was giving for them to be obedient, and that was that it might be well with them. And so we see that in verse number 40 of chapter 4, thou shalt keep therefore his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee this day, that it might go well with thee and with thy children after thee. Verse 16 of chapter 5, honor thy father and thy mother. This is a one of the 10 Commandments, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee, that thy days may be prolonged and that it may go well with thee. Of course, verse 29 that we looked at, verse 33 of chapter 5, ye shall walk in all the ways which the Lord your God hath commanded you, that ye may live and that it may be well with you. Verse 3 of chapter 6, and so on and so forth. So that's another one. And the other one that we went through, like I said, is in verse number 29 of chapter 5 again, that it might be well with thee and with their children forever. Another theme that is found throughout here is to make sure and pass on the understanding of obedience, fear of the Lord, that it is a good thing, that it will be well with you, and to teach them to your children. Verse number 7 of chapter 6, thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. We looked at one there in verse number 40 of chapter 4. May go well with thee and with thy children after thee, so on and so forth. So those are some of the themes that are throughout the book of Deuteronomy. And this is, again, just to set the table, the book of Deuteronomy here is the children of Israel. We see the timeline mentioned in verse number 3 of chapter 1. This sets where we're at in the annals of time. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, Moses spake unto the children of Israel. So this is 40 years in the wilderness. This is 40 years after they had wandered about, after they had come out of Egypt. God had brought them out through the Red Sea and so forth and so on. Moses is now recounting the history, what this generation's forefathers had been through, what they had experienced, how they had rejected the promised land that God had given unto them. They could have attained it, but they lacked faith, and so therefore they didn't. They died off in the wilderness, and now he is instructing them. He's telling them of the past so that they will not make the same mistakes in the future. And so here it is in chapter 6. Some of the things, let's go ahead and get back into our lesson here. We see some of the threats to God's love, some of the things that threatens the children of Israel to keep them from experiencing what God would have them to experience, and the closeness that they have unto God. We look, number 1, at the threat of prosperity, and this is in chapter 6 now, verse number 10. And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and goodly cities, which thou buildest not, and houses full of good things, which thou fillest not, wells digged, which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees, which thou plantest not. When thou shalt have eaten and be full, then beware, lest thou forget the Lord, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And so we see one of the things that is a threat unto, as it's termed in here in our book, that is a threat to the love for God, their love for God, is the threat of prosperity. When they gain all of the necessities of life, and not only the necessities, but then the good things in life, it has a tendency to take your mind off of the one who provided the necessities and the good things in life. This was true back then, and it is certainly true today. I was actually speaking we're talking with someone this past week, and there is a gentleman who has pretty much anything this world would have to offer, and so therefore it is a hindrance unto him and his understanding of the things of God. There is a threat of prosperity to the children of Israel. The threat of pluralism, verse number 13 in chapter 6. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. Ye shall not go after other gods of the people, which are round about you, for the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from off the face of the earth. The threat of pluralism, and that is simply, instead of worshiping and seeking after Jehovah God, the one God, the true God, that they would divide their love and attention unto other gods. And we understand some of those to be, Dagon and Baal and some of the other false gods and idols in which, and of course you see what happened down at the foot of Mount Oreb when they worshiped the golden calf. I mean, just over and over and over, where they worshiped other gods. Tell me, and we talked about this last week, is this a threat to Christians today? Worshiping other gods. It is. I wholeheartedly agree. Now, I don't know how many Christians have a, little statue of Fat Buddha there and they're offering donuts to them in their house. I hope none of you. So I don't think that is much of a threat. But what is? What other gods are? Entertainment, money, sport, video games. All worldly things. You see, what happens is, all too often, we as Christians, instead of having our focus and our love and attention upon Jehovah God, the true God, the living God, our attention, our love, and our focus gets divided. And we start focusing on video games and money and job and even family and so forth and so on. All of these other things. And before you know it, we're not focused on God at all. We're focused on all of these other things. And so it is absolutely a threat for our love for God. The threat of pluralism, the threat of prosperity. And then there's one that we haven't gone over, and that is the threat of doubt, verse number 6. I don't think we did anyway. Verse number 16 in chapter 6. Ye shall not tempt the Lord your God as ye tempted him in Massah. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his testimonies and statutes which he hath commanded thee, that thou shalt do that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with thee. Thou mayest go in and possess the good land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers. And so, let's go ahead and turn back over to Exodus chapter 17. Hold your place there, but turn over to the book of Exodus chapter 17. This is just after the children of Israel have come out of Egypt. In chapter 14, the Israelites passed through the Red Sea. Chapter 15, Moses is singing the praises of the Lord. And at the end of chapter 15, we see that there's bitter water. I mean, they come out, and God does a mighty thing with them, and all of a sudden, they have problems. All of a sudden, they have a trial. They have an issue. And church, listen, we will all go through trials. We will all go through trials. And they will be many, and they will be mighty. That is a given. But what is important is not the fact that we do or we don't, but the fact of how we respond in them. I mentioned this, I think it was Wednesday, and that is, in every trial there is a lesson. In every trial, in everything that we go through, we have something that we can learn. And in that trial, in the midst of it, we can learn something about God, and we can draw closer to God in the midst of those trials. And so, right after they come through this mighty deliverance, they enter into a trial. They have water, but they have bitter water. And so They complain about it. Bitter waters are made sweet, and they encamp there. God sends the quail and the manna because they murmured against Moses. In verse number 2, God sent the flesh for them to eat. Chapter 17, they have no water. So let's read the first part of chapter 17. Let me ask you this. Why do you think God would bring them out? God would do something so great as to bring them out of Egypt, with 1 plague, 2 plague, 3 plague, 4, 5 plagues, 6 plagues, 7 plague more. Well, you brought them out with all those 10 plagues and brought them through the Red Sea. I've never seen a sea parted. I would imagine it was a spectacular sight. That He would do all of these things for them just for them to have problems. Why would God do that? What was God trying to tell them or teach them? Well, they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything for that. It just happened to be they were there, and that's what happened. Right. Right. Yep. One of the things He wanted them to learn was dependence. Right? Depend on Him. And they had a problem with that. So, so why do you think we go through trials? One of the reasons, obviously, is to learn dependence upon Him. To trust Him more. The more faith you employ, the more your faith grows. And the more your faith grows, the more peace you have in the midst of the storm. That is the way it works. That is the way it works. And so the more trials we experience, the more faith we implore, the greater our peace grows, the better life we have. And that's what God wants for us. We're His children, just like I want the best for my children. He wants the best for us. You were going to say something. Right. Right. Yeah. I used that same illustration yesterday. We get stronger physically by exercising our muscles, and we get stronger spiritually by exercising our faith. All right, so in chapter 17, let's go ahead and read some here. Verse number 1 of the book of Exodus. It says, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses." Again, that's their response. That has been their response over and over and over again. "Wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord?" And Moses tried to point it back. Hey, listen, it's not me, it is God. Verse number 3, and the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? They still didn't get it because it wasn't Moses that brought them up, it was God. And Moses cried unto the Lord, verse number 4, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They almost be ready to stone me. They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, take in thine hand and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Oreb. Thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders. He called the place of the name Massah and Meribah, because of chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? And so, and that's the key verse there. Is the Lord among us or not? And so what did they do? They were doubting that God was even there. They were doubting that God was the God of providence. They were doubting that He was the God that sustains them. And why would they doubt? Why would they doubt? Didn't He? Didn't He prove Himself? Time and time again? The weakness in our flesh and the carnality in our flesh, what is in our flesh, as the Bible tells us, dwelleth no good thing. In our flesh, whenever we run into obstacles, whenever we run into problems, whatever it may be, our flesh desires to fret and worry and this, that, and the other. Unfortunately, it does cause us to doubt. And people will say, well, no, it doesn't cause us to doubt. Yes, it does. Yes. Right. That is. So here in chapter 17 of the book of Exodus, we have the children of Israel are doubting God's presence. They are doubting that God is with them. They are doubting that God is, able to sustain them or whatever. And that is the flesh in them speaking. They were a very carnal people. As much as God had done for them, as much as God had revealed unto them, as much as God has blessed them, they were still carnal. And that is very relatable to Christians today. And I say Christians, I'm talking about those that have been freed from the bondage of sin, those that have been born again, those that have been that have passed from death unto life, those that have been quickened in the Spirit. God had done a mighty work in that instance. He did a mighty work in my heart some 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago, as He did in Egypt in that day. Now think about that a minute. He did as mighty a work in me 20 years ago as He did in Egypt that day. And someone will say, well, how can you say that, preacher? I mean, He turned the water into blood. He made darkness upon the face of the earth for 3 days. He brought the death angel over, and He killed everybody that didn't have the blood applied to him. Yeah, He did all that. But you don't know the sin that I have committed. You don't know the depravity of my heart. And I'm telling you, When God washed me and He washed me clean, He did as mighty a work in my heart as He did in Egypt that day. And so, He has brought me out of the miry clay. He has made me alive, and He's done all of these things for me. But still, in my flesh, when troubles come and when trials come, my flesh wants to worry. My flesh wants to question. My flesh wants to doubt. That is the carnality that is within me. And if I continue in that, then that is the way I will live my life, and that is the way I will be. But going back to the point in which we made a moment ago, if I trust God, if I put my faith in the Lord, I put it a little here and a little there, God proves Himself time and time again. That faith grows. And it's like that illustration that I had read so many years ago. And there was a little boy that was doing something bad, and he talked to his grandpa, and the grandpa said something to this effect. He said, you know, in my heart it feels like there are two wolves fighting one another. And the little boy asked Grandpa, said, well, which one wins? He said, the one I feed. The one I feed. And in our hearts, we have the carnal, in our lives and everything we deal with, we have the carnal and we have the spiritual. And if we feed the spiritual, then it will win out. If we feed the carnal, then it will win out. And we can live carnally or we can live spiritually. And so the threat of doubt is a very real thing. This, as the book says, this incident becomes a reference point because over and over and over they would doubt. So, let me ask you this. How might doubt manifest itself in a person or a family today? How would our doubt manifest itself? Let me ask you this. How much time have you spent in prayer this week? Do you believe that God can? Do you have issues that God needs to work in? That God needs to move in? Anybody? Are you seeking His face? Is it just a little bit, or is it a continual thing, or what? Let me read you what it says here. Prayerlessness, complaining about problems, excusing oneself from serving in the church, sporadic church attendance, stingy giving, lack of concern for the lost, ignoring God's Word. That's what it says here in the book. And all of those things, if you look at it, would reveal some sort of doubt. Or it would reveal some sort of doubt, whether it's doubt in the God that can or will answer prayer, or doubt in what God said and meant in His Word. Whatever it is doubt. And I thought about that. I want to share this with you because to me it was a very powerful thing. I was out here working this past week, and how many people run a table saw? Right? Got a handful of people know how to run a table saw. Table saw is, the digit taker. That's what the table saw is. If you're not careful with it, you can lose several of your fingers. And I used to run one all the time. I haven't run one much. I don't run one much very often anymore. I don't have a shop set up. But I was running one this week, and I was outside the church here, and I was running it through, and my hands were passing by that blade, and I was thinking, I wonder if I ended up cutting my hand off or something and fell down bleeding, if anyone would, number one, notice, and, if they would do something about it, if they'd call the doctor, check on me if they saw me laying there bleeding. Because I figure, some people pass by the house and they see the preacher out there, they turn and they act like they don't see him, so they don't have to talk to him. And I wondered if I was laying there bleeding, if I was just going to die and bleed out, or if somebody passing by would care enough to look over and check and then call the cops, call the paramedics or whatever. I just wondered if anybody cared enough. And then I got to thinking, we pass by people every day that are literally dying, right? Spiritually, they are literally dying. I wonder how many of us just pass them by, and we don't look in their direction because we're afraid of the awkward conversation, or we don't pay attention to them. We just want to go about our way. How many people? And then I was convicted. Then I was convicted, thinking, how many times did I do that very same thing? Walked by someone laying there dying. Church, it is a humbling thought. It truly is. And it is a very real thought. I would hope to think that as you passed by my way, if you saw me laying there bleeding, that you would, number one, you would look over because you cared. And then you saw me in that condition and you would rush to my aid. I believe most of you would do that. Maybe not all. I believe all of you would. No, I'm not. But it's such an obvious thing, right? I mean, I would hope that all of you would look over, see that condition that I was in, and come and rush to my aid, because you knew that I was in trouble, and you knew that though I may be laying there and unable to do anything for myself, that you may not be able to patch me up. Where's Lori Kay? Is she downstairs? She might be able to patch me up or something, but you might not be able to patch me up, but certainly you could call on someone that could, right? You could call on someone that could. And church, that's all we need to do. We need to understand that as we're passing by these dead people, we may not be able to patch them up. We can certainly call upon someone that could. And we can make sure and get those two together. Or we can walk by and let them die. That's only our options. It's it. There is no third option. We could pass by and hope, hey, somebody else is coming by. Let them deal with that. And that's an obvious problem in the church today. Many people want to shun their responsibility and assume or figure that somebody else will come by and see the issue and take care of it. I may be dead by the time that person gets there. That person you see in the grocery store, that person you stand next to at work, wherever it may be, they may be dead by the time somebody else gets there. It's very important that we understand our responsibilities. And the death, if I were to die out here, that's the physical. All this is going by the way of the grave at some point. It's going to go. But the physical death is so much of a lesser concern than the spiritual death. In truth and in the eyes of God. It is so much of the physical death, and we focus on that. We think about that. Again, that's the whole carnal in us. We focus on that. We think about that. We're concerned about that, our health, and this, that, and the other. But that is so much of a lesser concern than the spiritual. All too often we don't see it that way, but that's the truth in which we live. All right, let's move on, finish this up. Israel's motivation to love God. Let's read verse number 20 of chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse number 20. And when the Son asketh thee in time to come, saying, what mean the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments which the Lord our God hath commanded you? Then thou shalt say unto thy son, we were Pharaoh's bondmen in Egypt. And I love the way that is. We were. Hey, listen, I was dead in trespasses and sin, but I'm not anymore. Amen. We were Pharaoh's bondmen in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and sore, upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, and upon his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from thence that he might bring us in, to give us the land which he sware unto our fathers. Did y'all get that right there in verse number 23? He brought us out from thence that he might bring us in. He brought us out of Egypt that he would bring us into Canaan's land. It was never his intention to keep them in the wilderness. They were kept in the wilderness for 40 years because of their lack of faith and their stubbornness to believe God and follow God. We have talked many times about what all of that means in type. Egypt being a type of sin, Egypt being the condition of a lost person, Canaan's land being the type of a person that is in the perfect will of God, and the wilderness in which is a type of someone that has been saved, brought out of Egypt, but are not in the will of God, in which the place where God wants them. They are in the wilderness, wandering around with no aim or purpose. And so, verse number 23, he brought us out from thence that he might bring us in. That's his intention for every Christian, to save you, to redeem you for a purpose, and that is to put you and to place you in the place in which he wants you, his perfect will, where you can enjoy all of the good things in which God has there for you, if you will just follow him by faith. Brought us out from thence that he might bring us in, to give us a land which he sware unto our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day. And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord as he hath commanded us. Now, Israel's motivation to love God, I mean, listen, it's very, I think it's very simple, and that is, it's easy to love God. We have reason to love God, and that is because God has. God desires. And God will. God has done for us. God desires the best for us. And God will provide it if we will follow him. Let me just read this here. It says, Moses instructed the adults to answer by recounting their merciful redemption from Egypt. Israel's deliverance from Egypt was their fundamental motivation for loving God as living as consecrated to him. Similarly, the redemption provided in Jesus Christ should motivate believers to love God and live for him. When people ask why we believe and act the way we do, our answer should point them to Christ's redemption work on the cross. And so, you know, I live and I pastor because of what God has done for me. I'm not doing this for any other reason. I'm not living a life that is as best as I can to be consecrated unto the Lord because I have to. I'm not doing it, certainly not doing it because I'm trying to get to heaven. That's already settled. Amen? It's already settled. I'm not doing it to try to get to heaven. I am simply trying to live a life consecrated unto him because of what he did for me, and because how he loves me, and because how he cares for me. And so that is the reason in which I try to do my best to live consecrated unto him, and that should be enough for every Christian. It should be enough for every Christian, what God has done for you. All right, so throughout today's lesson and throughout this, we've looked at various circumstances that the children of Israel had been in. Various circumstances, whether it was without flesh to eat, whether it was without water to drink, whether it was with bitter water, all of these different circumstances. Why are circumstances not a good gauge of God's love for you? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Why is that not a good gauge of God's love for us? Why is circumstances right? Right. God's love is not wishy-washy. And we've already established that as far as trials and circumstances that we may endure, we may go through, they're for our good. They're for our good and they're for a purpose. And so just as we do for our children, you know, we put rules in place and we put consequences in there, and then they may go through certain things so that they may learn from us as well. All right, and that's where we're going to leave it. Any thoughts or questions or concerns on any of that? Right. Now, if you or somebody were to ask me, what can I do to make my wife love me more, I'd say make sure my dirty clothes are off the floor. That would be the first thing that comes to mind today anyway. Right. Anything else? All right, we'll dismiss in a word of prayer. Brother Jeff, I'm going to ask you if you'll do that for us, please.
Father,